Okay, we're going to get started. Thanks so much for coming to join us today for today's research seminar with Suzana Sawyer. My name is Paul Sabin. I teach in the Department of History and also involved with the Yale's Environmental Humanities Initiative. And I want to start by thanking the School of Forestry for collaborating with us on a couple of talks this year in the research seminar, including as part of our Energy Humanities seminar series this year. We had Omalade Adumbi came in the fall talking about Nigerian oil, and we're continuing that effort today with actually not an unrelated topic in thinking about oil in the Ecuadorian case. So Suzana Sawyer is a professor of anthropology at the University of California, Davis, and for many years she has been working on studying the intersection between oil development, indigenous rights, and environmental issues in Ecuador. And so her first book was called Crude Chronicles, and that documented the rise in indigenous political organizing in the a somewhat more southern part of Ecuador than she's going to be talking about today, but looking at the rise of indigenous organizing since the 1990s and its connection to kind of political mobilization and also the oil development and environmental conflicts. And today, delighted to welcome her to talk about her new book project, Suing Chevron, which explores in the just immensely complicated and fascinating political and legal struggle over oil contamination in a more northern part of the Ecuadorian Amazon. So with no further ado, let's welcome Suzana.
Good afternoon, and thank you so much, Paul, for inviting me, and for everyone for being here. So I am going to talk about this lawsuit, a lawsuit against Chevron that was filed first in the United States in 1993. When it was first filed in 1993, I was a graduate student doing my dissertation fieldwork in Ecuador and became involved in sort of tangential ways with that initial process. And now, in 2019, I am trying to complete a book about a good substantial portion of that lawsuit. It is an immensely, ridiculously, overwhelmingly, staggeringly, mind-boggling, complicated lawsuit. And you have in your presence, we have in our presence, Julio Prieto, who is actually one of the litigating attorneys in Ecuador for this suit. So, and for myself, in writing a book about this, I've been very selective in trying to figure out how to tell a story. Because the lawsuit started in the United States. After 10 years of pretrial back and forths between the federal court and the Court of Appeals, it was sent to Ecuador to actually be litigated. The litigation started in 2003. I was tangentially involved again at that period in the early 2003-2004 period. And then I've sort of retreated from participation actually in the legal process. And that happened for various reasons, family, a little bit of health, and then also, and work, but also recognizing as I was delving more and more into the case that when I started reading the case file, that I didn't want to be easily labeled as being associated with the plaintiffs, who, of course, were the people that I had been affiliated with earlier, because of the trajectory of the case. So when the ruling from Ecuador arrived in 2011, the judge in the town where the case was taking place, Lago Agrio, found Chevron liable for $9 billion. And I'm sure many of you are familiar with this, and I'm sorry to be repetitive, but just so we're on the same page. $9 billion is a lot of money. And it sets an incredible precedent for transnational environmental litigation. And the oil industry is not happy and has fought fiercely in retaliation and in return. And so what Chevron did with an army of lawyers, an estimated over 2,000 lawyers, 60 legal firms, large corporate legal firms, they filed a counter lawsuit in the United States in the same federal court where the case was first filed in 2003. And it was a RICO case, which was a racketeering case, one of those cases that an act was established in the 1970s, I believe, to go after the mob. And they created, through very, very savvy lawyering, an immense amount of financing, they created a narrative which is a corruption narrative, such that the legal team in Ecuador, along with its scientific experts and the plaintiffs themselves, were all part of a racketeering corruption enterprise that procured a fraudulent ruling in Ecuador, such that, and this was a whole legal process that the U.S. court came to consider valid, and indeed agreed with Chevron that the $9 billion ruling in Ecuador was procured through fraud and was illegitimate in the United States. It went to the Court of Appeals, the Federal Court of Appeals, and the federal court upheld that ruling. So the dominant narrative for this legal case in the United States has been one of corruption. And this corruption narrative does a number of things. It comes out of particular colonialist, imperialist, racist hubris of U.S. law, whereby a whole judicial system of another country is ineffective, inefficient, fraudulent, corrupt. And that narrative slips in easily to understandings of supposed, what Chevron would call a banana republic of Ecuador, right? So it's an easy glide. But what's disturbing about that, in addition to all of its racial connotations, is that it totally elides taking the litigation seriously. So in the United States, there is no room within at least the popular press, within journalism, within a legal sphere of litigation for the Ecuadorian legal process to actually have been taken seriously. So what I've done is write a book that is looking largely at the litigation. I mean, and I should say, I haven't quite written the book. It's not in the press yet. So, but the chapters are all drafted. And what the book does is, again, it's because the case is so complicated, it's very selective. It does not deal with the intrigue of the lawyers, which is what the press has largely been concerned with. It does not deal with the legal battles of, she said, he said, somehow sort of sleights of hand, under-table dealings, all of that. It doesn't deal with any of that. That's definitely books that the legal team is much more prepared than I to write. But it looks at the court documents. So I've written a book largely through court documents, and then through various conversations with lawyers, with scientific experts, with a number of the plaintiffs, and with other friends who've been associated with the legal case, sort of, just checking in and making sure I'm on the right path, that I've got a good understanding. So the way that the book is structured is looking at some of the key issues, the key concerns that were questions within the lawsuit itself. One had to do with toxicity. So that's what the first chapter does. Another, so meaning is crude toxic? Is crude that's visible in the landscape toxic? And then then following that, does crude actually affect human health? So looking at the debates around epidemiology. And after that, well, what about contract? There are layers of contract between the Ecuadorian state and the corporation that according to the corporation, precluded its own liability, right? Looking at the way in which contract becomes a hedge over future liabilities. And then a chapter that's looking at what I call the sensoria, the judicial inspections themselves, and gaining an understanding of how evidence emerged in this litigation process that could never occur in a common law court as ours, that allowed different forms of evidence to reach understanding by the judge and everybody, actually. And then the sixth chapter looks at the actual ruling made by the judge in Ecuador. This is a ruling that is illegible in the U.S. court, essentially. The style is different, the legal reasoning is different, the form is different, and the language is difficult, and the translation is horrible. And then the seventh chapter looks at this counter lawsuit, this RICO trial, the counter lawsuit in the U.S. Federal court. And then sort of a third, the last chapter is trying to pull things together. Now, in looking at the litigation and the legal process, one of the things that recurrently came up was chemistry. And I found myself, because the first thing I ended up looking at was this question about whether or not crude is toxic. I found myself realizing that, oh my God, I've got to learn about the chemistry of hydrocarbons. And so I did. I studied a lot about chemistry. I learned about this is echoing strangely. Oh, okay. Learned about the morass of unknowns around hydrocarbons chemically, and then also ended up reading a lot from some chemical philosophers. And so chemistry and some of the thinking behind chemistry ends up being sort of a framing rubric for being able to think through how do we understand the complexity of this legal case without thinking about winners and losers, without thinking about good and bad, without having without falling into already known tropes of how we should understand this, of this aggressive, rapacious corporation and the valiant, noble victims of this. So to think about it just slightly differently. And then because the legal case is so complex, I've tried to add in voices. In addition to thinking about, because the chapters themselves largely come from legal documents, I've tried to add in some voices. So that just gives you some framing. And what I'd like to do today is just give a glimpse. I'm going to read for about 15 minutes. Give a glimpse of the fifth chapter that dealt with the judicial inspections and how we might think about this. Okay. Whoops. There we go. All right. So this fifth chapter is called Radical Inspections of Sensorium as Toxic Proposal and Proposition. This chapter regathers mid-flow, returning to the judicial inspections, seeking to name what remained only partially spoken, yet experienced viscerally in Sensoria, where hydrocarbon residue traced a multiplicity of unannounced encounters, where, without warning, an oil-laced labyrinth registered across surfaces, where a silent patina spun untold stories of uncertainties still to come. Seep back into the midst of the contentious, increasingly overwrought process of judicial ground-proofing. This was not the sort of judicial process in which we in the Anglophone world have become inured, where common law stages a confrontation between legal contestants before a judge, safeguarded in a wood-paneled court, our adversarial method of law. No, seep into a legal spectacle of another sort, that of the civil law tradition as it took shape over the 8 years of litigating the lawsuit against Chevron in Ecuador. Note the curious shape, the intriguing form of what the inquisitorial method of law could look like. Ooze inside the unfolds of the judicial inspections, multiple-day excursions of alleged contaminated sites, the Ecuadorian judge and clerk, teams of lawyers, scientific and technical crews, local dwellers, a scattering of press and curious individuals. Ultimately, 54 inspections consumed the parties constituting this lawsuit over the course of 5 years. At each inspection, the parties sought to materialize and rule and argue over the connections between hydrocarbons, formation waters, excavated earth pits, signed papers, sensate bodies, human, animal, plant, the consequential relationships between extracting crude oil and compromised life capacities. Local people gave sworn testimonies of crude oil's incursions into their lives. Have the industrial waste decanted into the environment caused the ill health of local residents and the ecological systems on which they and their lives depend? Have the deposits of industrial activity undermined health and well-being? The complexity of the situation gets broken down. Is the crude oil in the environment toxic? Is there a correlation between crude contamination and cancer? Both parties appeal to science to found their case. Soil and water samples are excavated from their milieu, thousands upon thousands in total. Experts examine samples in situ, assessing their texture, their color, their smell, positioning them in relation to their enmeshment in hydraulic flows, soil matrices, industrial infrastructure, practices of human habitation. Samples follow chains of custodies, some more, some less transparently, to national and international laboratories, where their chemical constituents are analyzed, standardized, and quantified. Reports emerge months later, multiple from each inspection site. Stacked together, the reports are tomes produced by each of the parties involved in the suit. Studies detail local hydraulic topographies, forest disruption, regeneration cycles, local soil stratigraphy and permeability, and most importantly, the complex chemistries of the hydrocarbon brew that constitutes crude. Despite being powerful in their suggestion, the scientific results of either party were not conclusive, not in any irrefutable sense. 5 years of judicial inspections could not deny the uncertainty clouding the relationship between crude operations and damage to life forms. The thousands of chemical analyses, hundreds of degradation reports, and a collection of epidemiological studies could neither definitively determine nor deny a cause and effect relationship or indisputable scientific proof. And what of the texture, the hue, the waft of crude that scientists inspected upon extracting soil and water samples from the forest floor? What of the people who spoke of themselves and their loved ones becoming ill from hydrocarbon entering their beings? Had they slipped from sensual encounter, recoded as stark data points, reaching the cold certainty of scientific statements, of objective and calculated technique? No. Half a decade of judicial inspections made clear that a lack of certainty should not be confused with an absence of understanding, of insight, prudence, acumen, a fluency with complex conditions. Listen to crude's distinct resonance. The inspections were active events. Lots was going on. The move of security, private and state, armored cars, Chevron's catered lunches, their lawyers' gold watches, the clank of augers, the squish of rubber boots, crying infants, barking dogs, the middle-aged farmer with pictures of her deceased husband and niece, the young woman whose skin ailments caused a lawyer to recoil, the horse whose insides desiccated after drinking poisoned waters. Slip along the crude lace surfaces, giving witness to contamination abound in wild profusion. Were one sufficiently attentive, The most quotidian of practices, that of walking, waiting, watching, of sensing, sniffing, smelling, of touching, feeling, and tingling, triggered experiential sensibilities. Petroleum and its very materiality emits, secretes, deposits its presence, and begs notice. It oozes underfoot, it leaks from embankments, it saturates soils, it congeals thick on surfaces of waste pits, it saturates decaying organic matter, it rests hidden below surface sediments, it glistens iridescent, it howls torrential when alit, it causes pipes to vibrate, their hum a constant to the pulse of the night frog. Its aroma tightens the throat, on and on. For creatures, human and non-human alike, the texture, the sight, the smell, and sound of crude comes as proximate, not abstract. Sensations experienced universally, not available to only a few, and they surface recurrently, not as a one-off, isolated event. This chapter considers the proposition that the 5 years of ground proofing of alleged contaminated sites constituted radical inspections. In chemistry, radicals are phenomena that breed chain reactions left to their own devices. But this and the previous chapter, so the one that I talk about earlier, taps radicals as a method tool for paying attention to the proliferation of possibilities that accompany a form. In the preceding chapter that I do earlier, I underscore how contract as a form compelled a perverse proliferation that sanctioned the displacement of liability under the law. Here I consider how the judicial inspections as form gave witness to a proliferation of sensoria that were absorbed, shared, and transmitted, heightening ways of seeing, of sensing, assimilating, subsuming by virtue of experience. Some sensoria were so ubiquitous that they had become normalized, and that would be the geophysics of crude. Some hardly attended to the way in which molecular aquatic chemical process actually evince crude. And some, slated to be dismissed, were those of the sworn testimonies and just the bodies and being in the environment. And that's what I'm going to just talk about a little bit here. In chemistry, radicals magnify particular chemical reactions that are not so much a relation as a form of relating, a co-enveloping, whereby an entity is carried into the makeup of another, thereby transforming both. And I'd like to suggest that the inspections as a radical opened a space for a kind of unique prehension of grasping understanding that proved to be consequential in the Ecuadorian court. And it proved in many ways to be much more consequential than the extraction of water and soil samples, or the arguing around epidemiology, or the debates around contract. Said otherwise, this chapter explores how the judicial inspections unfastened science's hold on the relationship between crude oil and life. And it suggests that the inspections obliged understanding beyond codifiable, quantifiable data points, laboratory essays and reports, statistical calculations, beyond the framing of contract and liability. All of that was very obviously, definitely important, but the effect of the judicial inspections were simultaneously much more spectacular and subtle. I think I'll just maybe, I'll give just a few more insights and then I'll open it up. So thinking about a vernacularly embodied sensorium. Percolate through the openings of the judicial inspections. The manifest other of imperial exploits and national progress, those colonos and indigenas living among oil operations affirm their presence haltingly. The force of disdain for people whose very beings hint at regression hangs thick. As the judicial entourage trekked through the scrub forest, tracing the conduits connecting drilled wellheads to waste pits to flaring gas pipes. At times, locals led detours to forgotten covered waste pits. They guided the collective down slippery gullies to obscure gooseneck pipes, where industrial waste trickles into the rivulets and wallows in slow-moving streams. They escorted the judge and parties to low-lying swamplands where shimmering crude keeps the secret of a berm collapse 2 decades and half a mile away. And they steered the inspection group to remote settlement arrangements and the compromised water sources used for drinking, cooking, cleaning, and bathing. We used to walk barefoot, my family and I. Because we're not wealthy, we didn't have shoes. We walked on the roads that were coated in crude. And around midday, the humidity and heat would make the roads smoke and steam of crude oil. The body would catch these breathings. That was pure contamination. I'm not an expert in oil and the arts of petroleum, but many men from the community have begun to suffer from their mid-bodies down, and many women have cancers of their reproductive organs. I think it was caused by the fluid, the crude oil. To walk on the steaming crude was as if your body was on fire. Interspersed in tracings of the geoengineering infrastructure that constitute oil operations, local residents were called upon to give testimony before the judge about the effects of hydrocarbons in their lives. Testimonies told by men and women living near former Texaco facilities were often emotional, sometimes cathartic events, at times wrenching with anguish with decades of racial and economic derision, neglect, and disavowal. At other moments, those who testified were self-possessed and angry. Local narratives relayed case after case of human suffering. The mere act of testifying in the presence of the animus palpable from Chevron lawyers was a defiant act. And to the extent that the corporation had to hear and confront local peoples and their speech, their agony, it was part of a process to enact a bond. The bond was not so much an instantiation of a relationship as exposing the harmful effects of the corporation's historical form of relating. How Texaco operations seeped into the constitution of living beings and dislodged any stability. The toddler who died vomiting oil waste. The otherworldly flesh erupting from within. The twins whose bones never ossified. The chicken who drowned in waste pit. The deep-cut scars from cancer surgery, or the inconclusive biopsy, the amputated limb. As radical sensorium, the narratives also bore into the makeup of those present, those who watched, those who heard, those whose bodies also walked through squishy soils. And similarly, transformed their being, if only momentarily. So I'm just going to say one more thing. Considering the judicial inspections a radical form extends a specific valence-imbued conception of what mattering does. For radicals are about passage and propagation. Those forming the judicial inspections, the judges, the lawyers, the scientists, were enmeshed, though differentially, within these sensoria. They traced material networks of proximate danger, unearthing a consideration that evidence could be other than that which is abstract and made reproducible. That proximity was substantial, central, and radical. It seeped into an altered experience, such that experience was different from what had existed before. This was an iterative, embodied, and sensorial understanding of harm, not a singular, precise, and detached understanding from scientific reports. Lurking on the periphery, even when in plain sight, radical sensoria transform, but only incrementally, never linearly, and often only at times. This is because radical valence is not about origins, progressions, and ends. Rather, it's about orbitals and intensities that destabilize dominant or prior forms. Radicals generate modes of expansion, propagation, occupation, contagion. It's about bodies moving and being moved, affecting and being affected, never singular or fixed. The judicial inspections tacitly encourage this attunement. Iterative practices impressed again and again the vital matrices suspending crude oil in life, to the point where it induced recognition for the court. Recognition that Judge Nicolas Zambrano, in his ruling, takes into consideration. Together, these sensoria provoked alternative forms of compassionate consideration and meaningful deliberation in his ruling. Thank you. I'll end there.
I'll jump in.
Yeah.
Thanks for your presentation, for some really lovely writing. I wonder if you could so a lot of the inspection was oriented, a lot of the inspections were oriented outwards towards the knowledge that would go into the legal process and the lawyers and the judge. But I wonder if you could talk about the sensory experience and the emotional experience for the people of the region themselves in terms of participating in the process, and what their participation in telling their stories and showing their suffering, how that might have actually had a lasting, if it did, impact on the people and the communities of the region itself.
I think in practice, they've been telling their stories for a long time. So the judicial inspections, in many ways, honed articulations that they've been engaged in for decades. I mean, since the 1960s and 1970s, when Texaco first started. I mean, people talk about having gone to, La Compañía to talk about, oh, there's been an oil spill, oh, there's seepage that's happening in this river, oh, our cows are dying, oh, my infant, is throwing up incessantly, right? So that practice, I think, emerges from the beginning. It then gained particular force when the lawsuit was filed in 1993. And there was an organization that was established in it was a little bit before the lawsuit actually was filed, but around the organizing for filing the lawsuit, called the Frente de Defensa de la Amazonía, which still exists, and during the litigation process was the primary organization that represented all of the peoples who were affected. So when the lawsuit was filed in the United States, it was a class action lawsuit, and it was done on behalf of 30,000 people, and they were thought to be sort of under this umbrella of this organization. Kind of along the way, pretty early on, a kind of a sub, or I don't know how you would say it, Julio, but another organization was subsumed within that organization, initially called Los Afectados, those who have been affected. And now it has a slightly more elaborate name. It's like the Union in Defense of the Peoples Affected by Texaco. But that organizational practice had to be built. I've written about this before, but in the northern Ecuadorian Amazon, where Texaco had its operations, if you remember that early map, when Texaco started building roads, which was pretty much in the late 1960s, that coincided with an already established state policy by the Ecuadorian government of colonization. And it was an impetus to try and relieve land pressure in the highlands and encourage peoples from the highlands and the coastal region to go to the Amazon and homestead. And so once the roads were built, once Texas had built their roads, then there became this grid of homesteading in this region. And the homesteaders, were initially right along the roads. Then, the next linea came, so another swath of homesteading. People would get land title to 50 hectares of land if they could, prove use, which oftentimes was deforestation, creating pasture. And the upshot of that was that the indigenous peoples who lived in the region were increasingly losing their land. And the tensions between indigenous peoples and non-indigenous peoples in that region for decades had been very, very, very tense because of this process. So the idea of creating a class for a lawsuit and creating an organization that was representative of that class was a huge struggle. It was not inevitable by any means. So just to, and I think part of the reason why it happened was because in the early 1990s, the indigenous movement was very sophisticated, savvy, and capable. And the colonos, who in 1992, 1993, the people who were heading this colono organization of the Frente de Defensa de la Amazonía, they went to the southern Amazon and asked for help from the indigenous organizations to figure out, how do we organize, how do we build alliances, how do we coordinate. So this is a very long-winded answer to your question. Yeah.
Hi, thank you for your talk today. So you may or may not be aware that we as a school are very much in the middle of conversations around our relationship and our potential role in working with companies like Chevron and working with major extractive industries with the best of intentions of like risk mitigation, like harm reduction and things like that, while still acknowledging our role as like Western, like, rich, educated, powerful people. So I guess what would you want to tell us as a class, myself included, who are going into these ultimately like harmful structures and institutions while trying to, with the best of intentions, with trying to make things better, and keeping in mind like your descriptions of like all the damage, of all the people hurt, the animals hurt, the land. What do you want us to keep at the front of our mind as we're trying to make the world a better place in less than perfect ways?
That's a challenging question. In my research, I have had very little contact with Chevron. And it's largely because the people who are the face of Chevron with regard to the lawsuit all have non-disclosure agreements, and they cannot talk to anybody unless they're given a go-ahead. And that includes people who are faculty at UC Davis, where I teach. Right? So the corporation has Chevron in particular, so I can't speak to all, but they have a very, very strong hold on how things are going to happen and unfold. And I'm sure that there are very many well-meaning individuals who work within that corporation. It's a huge corporation, right? And well-intended. And I've also seen, because I've done a bit of work around that, because this one chapter looks at toxicity and the science of toxicity. I have read close to hundreds of articles by industry scientists, many of them Chevron scientists, who transformed regulatory process in the United States for thinking about how to assess cleanup after crude oil, hydrocarbon contamination. And that was a long process. It took probably 7 years to a decade. And they have intimately affected how it is that toxicity can be proven under many conditions. And it's difficult to think how one would participate in that process and think they're doing good. And I say this being the daughter of a petroleum geologist, the granddaughter of a petroleum engineer, the niece of a petroleum geophysicist. So, I think it's a hard place to be in terms of thinking about environmental issues. So, yeah.
Thank you, and thank you for extraordinary writing as well as this immense research. Very, very moving. My question comes maybe in relation to Paul's as well, but so Ecuador is the first country to endorse the rights of nature, 2007, 2008, voted on in 2008, which is that nature has the right to exist, persist, maintain, and regenerate its vital cycles. So, of course, there'd be lots of further conversation on this. The Universal Declaration of the Rights of Mother Earth in Cochabamba is another iteration of this. So I just wanted you to comment, did this have any effect on the judge, the trial, et cetera, or where does this play out, if at all, the rights of nature?
So it didn't play out, per se, with the legal process because in Ecuador, as virtually every country, I assume, law is not retroactive, right? That you can't apply a law that was or a part of the Constitution, article in the Constitution that was instantiated in 2008 to processes that happened beginning in the 1960s. Julio, you probably have more insight about, if it emerged in discussions, conversations. It has.
But not going forward, even?
Say that again?
Well, you said it can't apply to what happened before 2008, but not going forward after 2008?
Yes, yes. But for this particular legal process, it was not part of the equation.
Yeah. But is it background discussion at all?
Yes. And I have to say that Julio Prieto is much more informed because he's involved in conceiving of lawsuits that take the rights of nature much more into consideration. Obviously, it has been very significant around the world as a new framework, a new language through which indigenous peoples can assert rights over what, for many of them, is already a living, sentient, personhood-filled environment, that landscape, So in Ecuador in particular, there are a couple of indigenous organizations who have definitely taken that into account. And there's been there was a court case at the Inter-American Court for Human Rights in San Jose, in Costa Rica, and that was filed by indigenous peoples in Ecuador. And part of the discussion around the hearing before the panel of judges at the court was around the rights of nature. Yeah. So I think it's going to be increasingly more and more. Yeah. And that becomes a moment when people actually define what the rights of nature constitutes, what it means. Yeah.
What if Chevron Texaco were Chinese?
Wow. There are a number of Chinese corporations now, oil companies in Ecuador. So I think my first reaction would be, I don't think it would matter. I think it all would have been the same. I mean, this happens to be a lawsuit against Texaco, then now Chevron, because of the merger. But what occurred is not unique. But what were you thinking?
It seems like the litigation in the United States was a key part of driving
Oh.
the process. If it had been seen for somebody, I don't think they'd be doing this in their head, right? What legal process would have unfolded? Probably not.
Right, but the legal process in Ecuador could have unfolded.
Okay.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
your view, that was, I'm not familiar with the pieces, so that was 80% of the answer, so it would have been similar.
Right. I'm sorry. When you first asked the question, I thought you were talking about the contamination,
Well,
the actual.
underneath the question is sort of the ability to seek redress against the Chinese multinational versus being able to use the U.S. legal forum because Chevron Technical is.
Yeah. No, you're absolutely right. I mean,
I'm asking the question because we know what's going on in a new way of extraction.
right.
Not just oil, but et cetera.
Right. So what sort of? Yeah.
Wondering if you have an opinion.
Yeah, I think the legal process could obviously have taken place in Ecuador. It was, so the case was filed in New York initially for multiplicity of reasons. One was that Texaco's headquarters were in White Plains, and so that was a jurisdiction. Because that's where it was anticipated that the pockets would be, the deep pockets, and because the plaintiffs at the time really did not trust the court system. I mean, you know, that might not have been 100% true, but that was the spiel. But when it came back to Ecuador, it could have been filed in Ecuador in the beginning. So that process, I guess, could happen, right? But then, yes, you think about enforcement, and yeah, I mean, the story on that end, you know, has been tragic and really discouraging and sad when it comes to the United States, and it would probably be the same. Yeah. I think that one, you know, the other little piece to think about maybe is the legal form and corporate law, the ways in which corporate lawyers can amass huge capacities. And I don't know what the legal system would be like at all in China, if that's even possible to engage, you know, with Sinop, so I'm not sure.
Thank you very much for the illuminating talk. I have a question about the process of translating the sort of sensorium of grief into formal grievances in the legal system. And I don't know if I was misunderstanding sort of your what you were getting at. So perhaps it's just a question for clarification. You know, the sort of ephemeral, nonlinear embodied reaction or interaction with the petroleum and the substance, the everyday sort of materiality of those substantial engagements. That struck me, the way you described it, as somewhat different than the sort of very raw, visceral anger and rage that you described on the stand in terms of the testimony given. And so I'm wondering if you could speak to sort of how that more ephemeral, nonlinear,
Yes.
embodied interactions translated into that sort of very raw anger, and sort of what gets lost in the translation, or if you felt like it was a very felicitous translation.
Well, the testimonies were not all angry. Many of them were tragic, sad, like people weeping, telling stories. So, I mean, anger was there, but it was, you know, these are very, very humble people. For many people, Spanish is not their first language. For many people it is, but it's, they're just very humble farmers. And so the anger wasn't like a big, huge protest anger. The anger is more like a surging, if that existed. But I think the primary sentiment was one of pathos. But kind of more broadly, so in the chapter that follows this, I actually go through a good portion, not all, a good portion of Zambrano's, the judge's ruling. And the dilemma of these legal cases is that the science is not absolute. The science is indeterminative in many ways, right? And so one of the ways in which he came to grapple with that is that he consciously says he is putting the voices, the conditions, the experience of local peoples as being more important than that of a scientist who is paid really well, brought into an area, doesn't really take the time to understand it, reads lots of documents, and writes reports. That's not exactly verbatim, but he goes into depth about talking about that. And then Chevron had demanded that he write a clarification of his ruling, and so he goes into even more depth at that level. And he essentially says, these people who have lived here, they know this historical reality better than any expert. And so it's a way for him then to, I'm creating this narrative, right? So as I understand it, it is part of his way of moving beyond science and into one of the large but predominant rationales for his ruling is the precautionary principle. He doesn't call it that per se, but it is the precautionary principle. And there was a Supreme Court ruling in Ecuador that was quite brilliant, that talked about in instances where there is uncertainty, scientific uncertainty, and yet there is known damage, we don't want to take risks. We're gonna close it. Meaning come to a decision. We're not going to be suspended in ambiguity. So that's what I see. One of the things that the inspections did. It did all these other things. It produced all of this science. There were all of these debates around toxicity and epidemiology and contract law. Big, important. But yeah, does that help? No. Yes.
Can I follow on that question?
Yeah.
Preface it by adding my appreciation and thanks and enthusiastic interest in your work.
Oh, thank you.
With regard to this entry of the sensorium into the judicial process, over the last 40 years, we've seen oral narratives enter into treaty agreements, such as in Canada. Yeah. In the tribal court system in the United States, first case was the testimony of a Navajo woman against a Navajo gentleman who, over a land dispute, and the burial of her umbilical cord was accepted as evidence. Her oral testimony of this corroborated by elders who witnessed that. I wanted to draw you out a bit more in the direction you have been going about the entry of oral narratives into the judicial record, since that's been the focus of some of your work. Is there a larger sense of this, what's happening with regard to indigenous oral narratives entering into judicial processes and other settings? There seems to be a possibility of comparison here.
Oh, wow. My only other experience with a legal case is the one that I mentioned at the Inter-American Court for Human Rights. And the Inter-American Court is it's in San Jose. It's a panel of judges. There's 9 judges from 9 different countries in the Americas. And the way that process worked, and it is in a courtroom. It's in a wood-paneled courtroom. And the way that process took place was there were probably 30 indigenous peoples from a community in Ecuador called Sarayaco who went up for the hearing. And not all of them, but by far not all of them, but I'd say 6 of them gave testimony and they spoke. And they spoke alongside James Anaya, who's he's not anymore, is he? Yeah, the rapporteur. Yes, exactly. So he spoke. Then many times these indigenous people spoke. There was one indigenous person who was the translator. James was there too to expound. There was another anthropologist from Argentina who spoke. So that's and the court took that testimony really seriously, and it was very interesting because this was the human rights law. Those courts are claims against the state. So the Republic of Ecuador was the defendant, and the court paid extreme attention to indigenous peoples, and there were stories about particular trees that were spirits, and there were a number of the judges, 2 or 3 of the women judges, were very persistent in trying to understand and grasp what was this other sort of ontological stance of indigenous peoples towards a landscape that was sentient. So
thank you all for coming. We're out of time. And thanks, Suzana, for a wonderful presentation.